The stone floor was cold against Virginia Foster's broken legs as she lay crumpled in the castle's lower chambers, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Blood seeped through the torn fabric of her servant's dress, where the bones had pierced skin, and each heartbeat sent waves of agony through her shattered limbs. Above her, the heavy footsteps of the guards echoed as they retreated, their cruel laughter fading into the darkness. She had served faithfully for 3 years, had given everything to this household, and this was her reward for daring to show kindness to the visiting knight. Sir Paul Ramirez knelt beside her in the shadows, his weathered face etched with fury and something deeper, something that made his dark eyes burn like coals in the flickering torchlight. His calloused hands hovered over her injuries, trembling with barely contained rage. The sight of her broken form ignited something primal within him, a protective instinct that had lain dormant through countless battles and endless campaigns. This gentle girl who had brought him water and bread without being asked, who had smiled at him when others looked away in fear, did not deserve this brutality. "They will pay for this," he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of a promise carved in steel. "Every last one of them will answer for what they have done to you." Virginia's eyes fluttered open, focusing on his face with difficulty. Even through her pain, she could see the transformation taking place within him. The controlled knight she had known was disappearing, replaced by something far more dangerous. The careful restraint that had marked his every action during his stay at the castle was cracking like ice in spring, revealing the warrior beneath. "Sir Paul," she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible above the distant sounds of revelry from the great hall above. "You must not. They will kill you for this. Lord Richard Green has too much power, too many men." But Paul Ramirez was no longer listening to reason. He had seen too much cruelty in his lifetime, had witnessed too many innocents suffer while those in power celebrated their brutality. Something fundamental had shifted within him as he looked upon Virginia's broken form, and there would be no going back from this moment. The knight who had arrived at this castle seeking only rest and provisions was gone, replaced by an instrument of justice that would not be denied. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The transformation of this knight will shock everyone in that castle, and Virginia's courage in the face of such cruelty will inspire you to keep watching. 3 days earlier, Virginia Foster had been just another servant in Lord Richard Green's household, invisible to most and grateful for that invisibility. She moved through the castle's corridors like a ghost, carrying out her duties with quiet efficiency while avoiding the attention of the Lord's cruel sons, Noah Gomez and Jerry Lee, who took pleasure in tormenting those beneath their station. Her small chamber in the servants' quarters was sparse but clean, and she had learned to find contentment in simple things. The warmth of the kitchen fires on cold mornings, the satisfaction of a task completed well, the brief moments of peace when she could steal away to the castle's upper battlements and watch the sun set over the surrounding countryside. The arrival of Sir Paul Ramirez had disrupted the castle's usual rhythm. He rode alone, which was unusual for a knight of his apparent standing, his armor bearing the scars of countless battles but maintained with meticulous care. His destrier was a magnificent beast, black as midnight with intelligent eyes that seemed to mirror their master's watchful nature. Lord Richard Green had welcomed him with the hospitality demanded by noble protocol, but Virginia had noticed the subtle tension in the air, the way conversations quieted when the knight entered a room, the careful distance maintained by the other guests. Paul Ramirez was not like the other knight who occasionally graced the castle with their presence. He spoke little, observed much, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove. His dark hair was streaked with premature silver, and his face bore the kind of weathered lines that came from years spent under foreign suns and hostile skies. There was a stillness about him that reminded Virginia of deep water, calm on the surface but with unknown depths beneath. She first encountered him on his second morning at the castle when she brought fresh water and bread to his chambers as was her duty. Most nobles barely acknowledged her existence, treating her as they would a piece of furniture, but Sir Paul had looked up from the letter he was writing and met her eyes directly. "Thank you," he had said simply, and the genuine gratitude in his voice had caught her off guard. When was the last time anyone had thanked her for anything? The small kindness had warmed her more than she cared to admit. "It is my duty," she had replied, keeping her voice carefully neutral as she set down the tray and prepared to leave. "Perhaps," he had said, returning to his letter, "but duty performed with care deserves acknowledgement." That brief exchange had planted something in Virginia's heart, a tiny seed of hope that perhaps not all nobles were cut from the same cruel cloth as her master and his sons. Over the following days, she found herself looking forward to her visits to his chambers, though she was careful not to linger or give anyone cause to question her behavior. Sir Paul was always courteous, sometimes offering a few words about the weather or asking after her health in a way that suggested he actually cared about the answer. It was this growing connection that had sealed her fate. Noah Gomez, Lord Richard's eldest son, had noticed her improved spirits, the way she carried herself with slightly more confidence, the small smile that sometimes played at the corners of her mouth when she thought no one was watching. Noah was a predator by nature, and he had learned to recognize the signs of happiness in his prey so that he could more effectively destroy it. "The serving wench seems unusually cheerful lately," he had mentioned to his brother, Jerry Lee, over their evening meal, loud enough for others at the high table to hear. "Perhaps she has found herself a lover among the stable boys." Jerry Lee had laughed, the sound sharp and unpleasant. "Or perhaps she has set her sights higher. I have seen the way she looks at our visiting night. Does the little mouse dream of catching a hawk?" The conversation had continued in this vein, growing cruder and more pointed until it reached the ears of Lord Richard Green himself. The Lord was a man who took any perceived slight against his authority as a personal insult, and the idea that a mere servant might dare to harbor romantic notions about a noble guest was intolerable to him. Virginia knew nothing of these discussions until it was too late. She had been in the kitchen, helping to prepare the evening meal, when the guards had come for her. Their rough hands had seized her arms, dragging her from her work without explanation, while the other servants watched in terrified silence. She had been hauled before Lord Richard in his private chambers, where he sat behind his massive oak desk like a judge pronouncing sentence. "You forget yourself, girl," he had said, his voice cold as winter stone. "You forget your place in this household and in this world. Did you think your shameless pursuit of Sir Paul would go unnoticed? Did you believe you could make a mockery of noble blood without consequence?" Virginia had tried to protest, to explain that she had done nothing improper, but her words fell on deaf ears. In Lord Richard's mind, the mere fact that she had been seen speaking with the knight was evidence enough of her guilt. The truth was irrelevant. What mattered was maintaining the rigid hierarchy that kept people like her in their proper place. The punishment had been swift and brutal. Lord Richard had decreed that she would be beaten as an example to the other servants, a reminder of what happened to those who dared to reach above their station. But Noah and Jerry Lee had convinced their father that a simple beating was insufficient for such audacity. They had argued that her legs should be broken, ensuring that she would never again be able to serve in the household, that she would be cast out to beg on the roads as a living reminder of the price of presumption. Virginia had been dragged to the castle's lower chambers, where such punishments were traditionally carried out away from the delicate sensibilities of the noble guests. The guards had held her down while Noah Gomez himself had taken up the iron rod, his eyes bright with anticipation. The first blow had shattered her left leg below the knee, the sound of breaking bone echoing off the stone walls like a gunshot. Her scream had torn from her throat involuntarily, a sound of pure agony that seemed to satisfy something dark in Noah's soul. The second blow had broken her right leg, and Virginia had mercifully lost consciousness as her body went into shock. But consciousness had returned all too soon, bringing with it waves of pain that seemed to consume her entire being. She had lain there in the darkness, listening to the guards joke about her fate while her blood slowly pooled on the cold stone floor. It was then that Sir Paul Ramirez had found her. He had been searching the castle, having noticed her absence from her usual duties, and grown concerned when his discreet inquiries were met with evasive answers and nervous glances. Something in the servant's manner had told him that Virginia was in danger, and he had followed his instincts through the castle's winding passages until he heard the sound of cruel laughter echoing from below. What he discovered in those lower chambers had awakened something primal within him, something that had been sleeping since his days as a young knight filled with idealistic notions of justice and honor. Over the years, he had learned to accept the brutal realities of the world, to focus on the battles he could win rather than tilting at every windmill of injustice he encountered. But seeing Virginia broken and bleeding on the stone floor had shattered that careful pragmatism. "Who did this?" he had asked, his voice deadly quiet as he knelt beside her. "Lord Richard's sons," she had whispered, her voice barely audible. "They said I was reaching above my station. They said I was pursuing you shamefully." Paul's hands had clenched into fists, and Virginia could see the fury building in his eyes like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. She had reached out with trembling fingers to touch his arm, trying to calm the rage she could feel radiating from him like heat from a forge. "Please," she had whispered, "do not let them destroy you as they have destroyed me. I could not bear to know that my suffering had brought about your death." But Paul Ramirez was beyond such considerations now. He had spent too many years watching innocents suffer while their oppressors lived in luxury and comfort. He had told himself that he was just one man, that he could not change the fundamental cruelties of the world. But looking at Virginia's broken form had shown him the lie in that reasoning. He was not just one man, he was a knight, sworn to protect those who could not protect themselves, and he had failed in that sacred duty. "They will answer for this," he had said again, and Virginia could hear the finality in his voice, the sound of a decision made that could not be unmade. He had gathered her carefully in his arms, mindful of her injuries, and carried her to a safer place deeper in the castle's foundations, where they would not be easily found. There, in a forgotten storage room lit by a single torch, he had tended to her wounds as best he could, with strips torn from his own clothing and water from his personal flask. His touch was gentle despite the calluses earned from years of sword work, and Virginia found herself studying his face in the flickering light. There was something different about Sir Paul now, something that had not been there during their previous encounters. The careful control that had marked his every action was gone, replaced by a cold purpose that made her shiver despite the warmth of his cloak wrapped around her shoulders. She could see the knight he must have been in his younger days, before the world had taught him the bitter lessons of compromise and pragmatism. "You must leave this place," she had told him as he finished binding her wounds. "Tonight, before they realize you know what they have done, Lord Richard has 50 men at arms, and they are loyal to him through fear, if not love. You cannot stand against such numbers." Paul had looked at her with something that might have been admiration. Even broken and in agony, she was thinking of his safety rather than her own. It was a nobility of spirit that put most of the so-called nobles he had known to shame. "And leave you to their mercy?" he had asked. "What manner of knight would that make me?" "A living one," Virginia had replied with a weak smile, "and that is more important than you know. The world has too few good men in it to lose another to pride and vengeance." But Paul Ramirez had already made his choice. As he sat beside her in that forgotten room, watching her fight against the pain that threatened to drag her back into unconsciousness, he had felt something fundamental shift within his soul. For too long he had been a knight without a cause, a sword without a purpose, beyond his own survival. Virginia Foster, this gentle servant girl who had shown him kindness without expectation of reward, had given him something he had thought lost forever, a reason to fight that went beyond duty or obligation. "Tell me about them," he had said quietly. "Noah and Jerry Lee, tell me their habits, their weaknesses, their fears." Virginia had looked at him with growing alarm, recognizing the tone in his voice. It was the voice of a man planning war, and she knew that nothing she could say would dissuade him from the path he had chosen. "Sir Paul, please," she had whispered. "I beg of you, do not do this thing. My suffering is not worth your life." "Your suffering is worth everything," he had replied, and the quiet intensity in his voice had stolen her breath away. "You are worth everything, Virginia Foster. You are worth more than all the lords and ladies in this castle combined, and it is time they learned that lesson." He had risen then, checking his sword and adjusting his armor with the methodical precision of a man preparing for battle. Virginia had watched him with growing desperation, knowing that she was witnessing the transformation of a good man into an instrument of vengeance, and that her own pain had been the catalyst for that change. There must be another way, she had pleaded. There must be some path that does not end in bloodshed. Paul had paused at the doorway, looking back at her with eyes that held both infinite tenderness and implacable resolve. There was, he had said simply. They chose otherwise when they broke your legs for the crime of treating me with kindness. And with that, he had disappeared into the darkness of the castle's corridors, leaving Virginia alone with her pain and her fears. She had tried to call after him, but her voice was too weak to carry far, and she knew that even if he heard her, it would not change his mind. Sir Paul Ramirez had found his cause at last, and nothing in heaven or earth would turn him from it now. The castle above continued its evening revelries, unaware that death walked its halls in the form of a knight who had finally remembered what it meant to serve something greater than himself. In the great hall, Lord Richard Green raised his goblet in a toast to his own magnificence, while his sons laughed and joked about the servant girl they had crippled. None of them noticed the figure in battle-worn armor who had begun to move through the castle like a shadow checking exits, noting guard positions, and preparing for a reckoning that would shake the very foundations of their cruel little world. Virginia lay in the darkness, listening to the distant sounds of music and laughter from above, and prayed to whatever gods might be listening that Sir Paul would find some measure of wisdom before it was too late. But in her heart, she knew that her prayers would go unanswered. She had seen the look in his eyes, had heard the finality in his voice, and she understood that the gentle knight who had thanked her for bringing him water was gone forever, replaced by something far more dangerous. The transformation had been building since his arrival at the castle, though Virginia had not recognized it at the time. She had noticed the way he watched the interactions between the nobles and their servants, the slight tightening around his eyes when Noah or Jerry Lee made their cruel jokes, the careful way he held himself when witnessing the casual brutalities that were part of daily life in Lord Richard's household. Paul Ramirez had been a man walking on the edge of a precipice, and her broken legs had been the final push that sent him over. Now, as she waited in the forgotten storage room with only a guttering torch for company, Virginia found herself thinking about the strange turns that life could take. 3 days ago, she had been nobody special, just another servant going about her duties with quiet resignation. Now she was the catalyst for what promised to be a night of blood and vengeance that would be remembered long after she was gone. The irony was not lost on her that the kindness she had shown to Sir Paul, the simple human decency that had cost her so dearly, might now be the cause of even greater suffering. She had wanted only to brighten his days with small gestures of care and attention, never dreaming that such innocent actions would be twisted into something shameful by minds that could not conceive of kindness without ulterior motive. Above her, the castle's routine continued undisturbed. The guards made their rounds with the casual indifference of men who had never faced a real threat. The servants cleared away the remains of the evening meal while avoiding the wandering hands of drunken nobles. And Lord Richard Green settled into his favorite chair by the great fireplace to regale his guests with stories of his own imagined heroism. None of them were prepared for what was coming. Sir Paul Ramirez had spent the better part of an hour moving through the castle's passages, mapping the layout in his mind and identifying the key points he would need to control. His years of military experience served him well now, allowing him to think tactically even through the red haze of his fury. This would not be a berserker's charge into certain death, but a carefully planned campaign with specific objectives and contingencies. His primary targets were clear: Noah Gomez and Jerry Lee, the two who had taken such pleasure in breaking Virginia's legs. Lord Richard Green himself was secondary. While he bore ultimate responsibility for the culture of cruelty that pervaded his household, he had not personally wielded the iron rod that had shattered innocent bones. The guards who had held Virginia down would also answer for their actions, but they were tools rather than architects of her suffering. Paul's plan was simple in concept but complex in execution. He would move through the castle methodically, eliminating threats and cutting off escape routes until he had cornered his primary targets. The key was to prevent word of his actions from spreading too quickly, to maintain the element of surprise for as long as possible, while systematically dismantling Lord Richard's ability to mount an organized resistance. The first guard died quietly, a blade between the ribs as he made his rounds through the castle's lower levels. Paul caught the body, for as it could fall, dragging it into an empty chamber where it would not be immediately discovered. The man's keys and weapons joined Paul's growing arsenal, tools that would prove useful in the hours to come. The second guard proved more alert, turning at the last moment to see death approaching in the form of a grim-faced knight. His cry of alarm was cut short by Paul's sword, but the damage was done. Somewhere in the castle above, other guards would have heard that truncated shout and would be coming to investigate. Paul smiled grimly as he wiped his blade clean. Let them come. He had faced worse odds on foreign battlefields and lived to tell the tale. These pampered castle guards, grown soft on easy duty and their master's wine, would learn what it meant to face a knight who had found his purpose again. The sound of running feet echoed through the corridors as the castle's guards began to mobilize. Paul could hear their confused shouts, the clatter of hastily donned armor, the scrape of swords being drawn from sheaths. They were reacting to a threat they did not yet understand, following procedures designed for external attacks, rather than the enemy that now moved among them like a specter of judgment. 3 guards rounded the corner together, weapons ready, but eyes uncertain in the flickering torchlight. They saw Paul standing over their fallen comrade and charged without question, their loyalty to Lord Richard overriding any tactical considerations. It was exactly what Paul had expected, and he was ready for them. The first man died on Paul's sword before he could bring his own weapon to bear, momentum carrying him forward onto the blade that punched through his leather armor like parchment. The second managed a wild swing that Paul deflected easily, riposting with a thrust that opened the man's throat in a spray of crimson. The third guard, seeing his companions fall so quickly, tried to retreat and call for help. But Paul was faster, his sword taking the man in the back as he turned to flee. Silence fell over the corridor once more, broken only by the distant sounds of alarm from the upper levels. Paul knew that his time was running short now. Soon Lord Richard would marshal his full strength, and the castle would become a fortress turned against him. He needed to reach his primary targets before that happened. Moving with renewed urgency, Paul made his way toward the Great Hall, where he knew Noah and Jerry Lee would be enjoying their evening entertainment. The corridors that had seemed so welcoming during his stay as a guest now felt like the arteries of some great beast, pulsing with hostile life as guards and servants scurried about in response to the growing crisis. He encountered 2 more guards on his way up from the lower levels, dispatching them with the cold efficiency of a man who had long since moved beyond anger into something more dangerous. These were not deaths born of rage, but of calculation, each life taken serving a specific purpose in his larger plan. The great hall's massive doors stood open, spilling light and laughter into the corridor beyond. Paul could hear the voices of his targets inside, Noah's braying laugh rising above the general conversation as he no doubt regaled the company with some tale of his own cleverness. The sound sent fresh fury coursing through Paul's veins, but he kept his emotions tightly controlled. This was not the time for passion. This was the time for justice. Paul stepped into the great hall like an avatar of vengeance, his armor stained with blood and his sword naked in his hand. The conversation died instantly as every eye turned toward him, the sudden silence so complete that the crackling of the great fireplace seemed loud as thunder. Lord Richard Green half rose from his chair, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and growing alarm as he took in Paul's appearance. "With Paul," he began, his voice carefully controlled despite the obvious tension. "What is the meaning of this? Why do you come before us armed and bloodied?" "I come seeking justice," Paul replied, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly still air. "Justice for Virginia Foster, whose only crime was showing kindness to a guest in your house." Noah Gomez laughed, the sound sharp and nervous in the silence. "The serving wench? What concern is she of yours, Sir Knight? Surely a man of your station has better things to worry about than the punishment of an impudent servant." Paul's eyes fixed on Noah with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey. "Her legs were broken at your command. She lies even now in agony because you could not bear the thought that she might find joy in simple human kindness." "She forgot her place," Jerry Lee interjected, emboldened by his brother's apparent confidence. "We merely reminded her of it. The natural order must be maintained, or chaos follows." "The natural order," Paul repeated, his voice soft and deadly. "Tell me, young lord, what is natural about breaking the bones of an innocent girl?" What order is served by such cruelty? Lord Richard had finally grasped the full scope of what was happening, and his hand moved toward the sword at his side. You dare to question my authority in my own hall? You dare to threaten my sons over the discipline of a servant? I dare many things, Paul said, advancing slowly into the hall, while the assembled nobles and their retainers watched in frozen fascination. I dare to remember what it means to be a knight. I dare to stand for those who cannot stand for themselves. And I dare to see justice done, regardless of the cost. The first of Lord Richard's men-at-arms had begun to filter into the hall, alerted by the sounds of combat from below. They formed a loose circle around Paul, weapons drawn but uncertain how to proceed. Their lord had not yet given them clear orders, and the situation was unlike anything in their experience. You are outnumbered, Sir Paul, Lord Richard said, his confidence returning as more of his men appeared. Surrender now, and I may yet show you mercy. Continue this madness, and you will die here in my hall. Paul smiled, and there was something in that expression that it made several of the guards take an involuntary step backward. I have been outnumbered before, my lord. It has never troubled me overmuch. Kill him, Noah commanded, his voice cracking with fear and fury. Kill him now! But the guards hesitated, unwilling to be the first to move against a knight of Paul's obvious skill and reputation. They had all heard stories of what a truly dangerous warrior could accomplish when cornered, and none of them were eager to test those tales against reality. That hesitation cost them dearly. Paul exploded into motion with a speed that belied his years, his sword describing deadly arcs through the air as he carved his way through the circle of guards. 3 men fell in the first few seconds, their blood spattering the rushes that covered the hall's floor, and suddenly the careful formation dissolved into chaos as everyone tried to get away from the whirlwind of death that had erupted in their midst. The great hall erupted into pandemonium as nobles screamed and fled while guards tried desperately to contain a threat they were not equipped to handle. Paul moved through them like death incarnate, his sword reaping a terrible harvest as he fought his way toward his primary targets. Noah and Jerry Lee had retreated behind the high table, using it as a barrier while they shouted for their guards to protect them. Lord Richard himself had drawn his sword, though he made no move to engage Paul directly. Instead, he bellowed orders at his men, trying to coordinate a response to the crisis that had exploded in his hall. But his guards were trained for ceremony and intimidation rather than real combat, and they were no match for a knight who had spent decades perfecting the art of war. You cannot escape justice forever, Paul called out as he cut down another guard who had tried to flank him. Your son's cruelty will be answered, whether in this life or the next. You are mad, Lord Richard shouted back, mad to throw your life away over a servant girl. She is nothing less than nothing. She is everything, Paul replied, his sword taking another life with surgical precision. She is what separates us from the beasts, the proof that kindness still exists in this cruel world, and you broke her legs for daring to show it. The tide of battle began to turn as more guards poured into the hall, their numbers finally beginning to tell, despite Paul's superior skill. A blade opened a gash along his arm, another found a gap in his armor and drew blood from his side. He was mortal after all, and even the greatest warrior could not stand forever against overwhelming odds. But Paul Ramirez was not trying to win an impossible battle. He was buying time, creating chaos, and driving his enemies toward a specific goal. As he fought, he maneuvered himself closer to the high table where Noah and Jerry Lee cowered, using the press of bodies and the confusion of combat to mask his true intentions. When the moment came, he moved with the decisive speed of a striking serpent. A feint to the left drew the attention of the guards, and then he was vaulting over the table, his sword seeking the throat of Noah Gomez with unerring accuracy. The young lord's eyes widened in terror as he realized that death had found him at last, that all his father's wealth and power could not protect him from the consequences of his cruelty. The blade took Noah in the chest, punching through his fine silk doublet and into the heart beneath. He died with Virginia Foster's name on Paul's lips, a prayer and a promise combined into one final act of justice. Jerry Lee screamed and tried to flee, but Paul was already turning toward him, his sword dripping with his brother's blood. The second son of Lord Richard Green had perhaps 10 seconds to contemplate his fate before Paul's blade found him as well, opening his throat in a spray of crimson that painted the wall behind him. "My sons," Lord Richard cried out in anguish, his voice breaking as he saw his heirs fall. "You have murdered my sons." "I have executed them," Paul corrected, turning to face the Lord with blood streaming in from multiple wounds. As they executed Virginia Foster's ability to walk, to serve, to find joy in simple things. The only difference is that their deaths were quick. The remaining guards had pulled back, forming a defensive circle around their lord, while they tried to process what had just happened. In the space of minutes, their world had been turned upside down. The visiting knight, who had seemed so controlled and civilized, had revealed himself to be something far more dangerous. And now two of the most powerful men in the region lay dead at his feet. Paul stood over the bodies of his enemies, swaying slightly from blood loss but still radiating an aura of deadly purpose. His mission was not yet complete. Lord Richard Green still lived, still drew breath while Virginia Foster lay broken in the depths of his castle. That imbalance demanded correction. "You want to know why I do this?" Paul asked, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "You want to understand what could drive a man to throw away his life for a servant girl?" He took a step toward Lord Richard, and the circle of guards tightened around their master. "I have spent my life in service to nobles like you, fighting your wars, protecting your interests, believing that there was honor in such service. But I have learned something in my years of wandering, something that you and your sons never understood." Another step forward, and Paul could see the fear growing in Lord Richard's eyes. True nobility is not born of blood or title. It is born of character, of the choice to protect rather than prey upon those weaker than yourself. Virginia Foster, a servant girl with no name or fortune, has more nobility in her broken body than you and your sons possessed in your entire lives. "She is nothing," Lord Richard repeated desperately, as if the words could somehow undo what had already been done. "A servant, a peasant, a creature of no consequence." "She is everything," Paul said again. And now he was close enough that the guard's weapons were almost touching his chest. "She is the reason knights exist, the reason we take vows to protect the innocent. She is what we are supposed to serve, not you." Lord Richard raised his own sword with trembling hands, knowing that his guards alone would not be enough to stop this avenging angel. "You will die for this," he said, trying to inject some authority into his voice. "You will die. And she will still be broken, still be nothing." Paul smiled, and there was something peaceful in his expression, despite the blood that covered him. "Perhaps, but she will know that someone stood for her, that someone believed she was worth defending. That is more than most of us can say when we face our final judgment." The end came quickly. Paul's last charge carried him through the circle of guards like a thunderbolt, his sword seeking Lord Richard's heart with the same precision that had claimed his sons. The Lord's blade met Paul's in a brief clash of steel, but he was no match for a knight who had spent his life perfecting the art of war. Lord Richard Green died with his eyes wide in shock, unable to believe that his wealth and power had not been enough to save him. Paul fell to his knees as the remaining guards closed in, their spears and swords finding their marks at last. He had known this would be the outcome from the moment he made his choice in that forgotten storage room. There had never been any possibility of survival, only the hope that his death would have meaning. As darkness closed around him, Paul's thoughts turned to Virginia Foster, lying broken in the castle's depths. He hoped she would understand what he had tried to do, hoped she would find some measure of peace in knowing that her suffering had not gone unanswered. The world was cruel and unjust, but sometimes, just sometimes, the innocent found champions willing to stand against the darkness. In the forgotten storage room where Paul had left her, Virginia Foster heard the sounds of battle echoing through the castle's stone walls. The clash of steel, the screams of dying men, the thunder of running feet, all of it filtered down to her hiding place like the rumble of a distant storm. She knew with terrible certainty what those sounds meant, knew that Sir Paul Ramirez was fighting and dying somewhere above her for the crime of caring about her suffering. Tears streamed down her face as she listened to the symphony of violence that marked the end of a good man's life. She had begged him not to do this thing, had pleaded with him to think of his own survival rather than her honor. but she had seen the look in his eyes and known that her words would not reach him. The transformation had already begun, the gentle knight she had known disappearing into something harder and more terrible. The sounds of battle gradually faded, replaced by the shouts of men searching the castle and the wails of women mourning their dead. Virginia closed her eyes and tried to imagine what the great hall must look like now, painted in blood and littered with bodies. She had never wanted such violence, had never asked for such a terrible price to be paid for her suffering. But she understood now that the choice had never been hers to make. Sir Paul Ramirez had found his cause at last, and nothing in heaven or earth could have turned him from it once his mind was made. He had spent too many years watching injustice flourish while good people suffered, and her broken legs had been the final straw that broke his carefully maintained restraint. In choosing to stand for her, he had chosen to remember what it meant to be a knight in the truest sense of the word. Hours passed before the searchers found her hiding place, and when they did, it was not Lord Richard's guards who discovered her, but a group of servants led by Sarah Hall, the castle's head cook. The older woman's face was pale with shock as she knelt beside Virginia's makeshift pallet, her gentle hands checking the crude bandages that Paul had applied. "Oh, child," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "What have they done to you? What have they done to all of us?" "Sir Paul," Virginia managed to whisper. "He?" Sarah nodded gravely, unable to speak the words aloud. But her expression told Virginia everything she needed to know. The knight who had thanked her for bringing him water, who had seen her as a person worthy of respect and kindness, was gone forever. "He killed them," Sarah said finally. "Lord Richard, both his sons, half the guards in the castle. They say he fought like a man possessed, like the very devil himself had entered his soul." Virginia closed her eyes, feeling a complex mixture of grief and gratitude wash over her. Paul had kept his promise, had seen that justice was done regardless of the cost. Noah and Jerry Lee would never again take pleasure in breaking innocent bones, would never again torment those too weak to defend themselves. But the price of that justice had been the life of the only person who had shown her genuine kindness in years. The days that followed brought changes that Virginia could never have imagined. With Lord Richard and his sons dead, the castle fell under the authority of the king's appointed administrators, men who had little tolerance for the casual cruelties that had marked the previous regime. The guards who had participated in Virginia's torture were dismissed from service, and new policies were put in place to protect the castle's servants from abuse. Virginia herself became something of a legend among the common folk. The servant girl whose suffering had awakened the conscience of a knight and brought down a dynasty of tyrants. Bards began to sing songs about Sir Paul Ramirez and his final battle, tales that grew in the telling until they bore little resemblance to the truth, but captured something essential about the man's character and sacrifice. But Virginia cared little for songs and stories. Her legs would never heal properly, leaving her with a permanent limp that served as a constant reminder of that terrible night. She could no longer perform the physical duties that had once defined her life, but the new administrators found other ways for her to serve, recognizing that her experience and wisdom were valuable assets. In time, she became something like a mother figure to the younger servants, teaching them not only their duties, but their rights as well. She spoke often of Sir Paul Ramirez, keeping his memory alive through stories of his kindness and his final act of heroism. She wanted them to understand that nobility was not a matter of birth, but of character, that even the humblest person could find champions if they remained true to their principles. On quiet evenings when her duties were done and the castle had settled into peaceful routine, Virginia would make her way slowly to the battlements where she had once watched the sun set over the countryside. There, in the place where she had found moments of peace during her darkest days, she would remember the knight who had seen her as worthy of respect and protection. The world was still cruel, still unjust, still filled with those who preyed upon the weak and innocent. But Virginia Foster had learned something precious in the depths of her suffering, that kindness could inspire courage, that even the smallest acts of human decency could plant seeds that would grow into something magnificent and terrible. Sir Paul Ramirez had given his life to prove that she mattered, that her pain was not insignificant, that justice could still find a way to shine through the darkness. She would carry that knowledge with her for the rest of her days, a light that no amount of cruelty could extinguish. And in the stories she told, in the lives she touched, the spirit of the knight who had died for her would live on, inspiring others to stand against injustice wherever they might find it. The servant girl who had once been broken for the crime of showing kindness had become something more than she had ever imagined possible. A keeper of hope in a world that desperately needed reminding that some things were worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth remembering long after the last sword had fallen silent. In the end, that was Sir Paul Ramirez's greatest victory. Not the deaths of those who had wronged her, but the transformation of Virginia Foster from victim to guardian, from broken servant to living testament to the power of standing up for what was right. Her legs might never carry her as they once had, but her spirit soared free, unbroken by cruelty and strengthened by the knowledge that she had been deemed worthy of a knight's ultimate sacrifice.